delighted to introduce my friend and distinguished scholar and colleague, Martin Sherwin. Many of you have probably heard of him. He is the co-author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Robert Oppenheimer, which if you haven't read it, you should read it. It is a fantastically interesting and important story in American history. It's titled American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. Marty's first book was A World Destroyed, Hiroshima and Its Legacies, which is still, I think, one of the very best books on the decisions surrounding Hiroshima. And he's just published a new blockbuster book that I hope all of you will read, and it is beautifully written, sections of which you can use even with high school students, Gambling with Armageddon. And this is a nuclear roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Marty, thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and I hope we'll create a little electricity for Texas.
I think you and I tend to create electricity, whether it's useful or not. Our wives can describe. But so I guess the first question, Marty, is how should we talk about the origins of the Cuban Missile Crisis? The story is usually told of these missiles arriving in Cuba. The Soviets have imposed their way, and we have to react to defend ourselves. You tell the story differently. How do you tell the story?
Right. You know, one of the questions I asked when I decided to write the book was, why did Khrushchev put intermediate and medium range missiles in Cuba as a prophylactic against an American invasion of Cuba? I mean, why those huge missiles? I mean, could have sent lots of troops, which he did. Could have sent tactical nuclear weapons, which he did, which we didn't know he did, and announced that these things are there to defend Cuba. It's very strange that he, picked these very provocative missiles that can be defined as a deterrent, but also as an offensive weapon. It was very dangerous. Why did he do it? Well, if you look back to as far as most of the historiography goes for the Cuban Missile Crisis, it says that the crisis began with the Cuban Revolution. Well, of course, there wouldn't have been a Cuban Missile Crisis without the Cuban Revolution. Naftali and Fersenko, in their very good book, One Hell of a Gamble, make that argument. But why those intermediate range weapons? And as I thought it through and planned the structure, I understood that you really had to begin with Hiroshima, because with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear weapons were introduced as legitimate, quote unquote, weapons that were effective. They prevented the invasion. They saved, quote unquote, 1 million American lives, according to the American narrative. So these weapons became, for the Truman administration, a backstop. And then for the Eisenhower administration, they became the front line. Eisenhower moved nuclear weapons from the Truman backstop, so to speak, to massive retaliation, brinksmanship. When Eisenhower came into office, there were about 1,200 nuclear weapons in the American arsenal. When he left office, there were, hold your breath, 23,000 nuclear weapons. So he built up, essentially the structure that we lived with throughout the Cold War. Massive, massive numbers of nuclear weapons. And after Sputnik in October 1957, Eisenhower deployed Jupiter missiles, which are intermediate range nuclear missiles, to Turkey and to Italy. Turkey is 130 miles from Soviet territory. As Khrushchev said, what's the difference between 130 miles and 90 miles? So when the Bay of Pigs failed and Castro and Khrushchev were absolutely certain that the Americans were going to invade Cuba, and there's a lot of evidence, as Jim Hirschberg has shown, that that invasion was planned, he said, well, I got it. Eisenhower put those Jupiters in Turkey. I'm going to put the same kind of weapons in Cuba. And then there will be a balance of fear, as he said. So that's the origins of the crisis and the origins of why the crisis was the kind of crisis it was, a Cuban missile crisis,
Right.
not just a Cuban crisis.
Right, right. And Marty, one of the questions you ask and explain in the book is why the Kennedy administration was so surprised, because what you've laid out seems pretty logical, right? We have our missiles in Turkey. Why shouldn't they be able to put their missiles there? They have a friendly regime in Cuba that we have threatened and continue to threaten. So in a certain way, this seems logical, tit for tat, right? So why were Kennedy and those around him and Americans in general, why were we so surprised?
Well, first of all, Khrushchev was very skillful, or Soviets were very skillful in sneaking those in. The Americans never thought that Khrushchev would do something that provocative. They assumed the Soviets understood the American mentality about the control of the Caribbean area and the Western Hemisphere, Monroe Doctrine stuff and all of that. And some of the Soviets did. Anastas Mikoyan, who was Khrushchev's closest advisor, was totally against this. He said, it's going to send these guys, up in the air. This could ruin everything. But Khrushchev was determined. He said, they did it, we can do it, and that's it. So the surprise was because the expectations were totally different on the part of the Americans, and because it really was a surprise. I mean, Khrushchev snuck him in. He didn't announce that he was, as Castro wanted him to, that, this is an alliance. We have a military alliance, and we're putting the weapons in Cuba exactly the same way you put them in Turkey.
Right.
So it was a big surprise.
And ostensibly, Khrushchev chose the surprise route because he wanted to create a fait accompli. He did not want to give the Kennedy administration the chance to try to stop him, right?
Exactly.
And it's worth just going over this. How did we find the weapons, and how did we
on October 14th, U-2 flew over Cuba, taking photographs. And on October 15th, by the evening, the National Photo Interpretation Center had discovered that some of the photographs showed that platforms were being built for medium-range missiles, and I think they had a shot of one of the missiles. They measured it and compared it to other things, and on the night of October 15th, McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor, was called by Ray Klein of the CIA and said, they're there. They were the missiles. So, that's what they were looking for, those things. So, we say it's a surprise, and it was a surprise, but they were alert to that surprise could happen. So it was all Ray Klein had to say was, they are there, and they are the missiles, and there is Cuba. And so the next morning at 9 o'clock, Bundy goes up to Kennedy's bedroom and says, we discovered these missiles, shows him the photographs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis for the Americans have begun. And there are really two missile crises. The American one lasts 13 days. That is from the discovery of the missiles until Kennedy gives his blockade speech on October 22nd at 7 o'clock at night. Khrushchev doesn't know about that. The Americans know that the missiles are there for that first week. And from October 22nd in the evening till October 28th, Sunday morning, that is the real missile crisis. That is when Khrushchev and Kennedy are both out there with the possibility of starting a nuclear war.
And to me, Marty, this is really where your new book is startlingly new in the way we understand this, because most, or many historians at least, and many textbooks that I've seen, treat that period, those two crises, as you call them, those 13 days, in the way that the Kennedys wanted them to be treated, as their finest hour. And even some have listened to the tapes and have said the tapes show that. You have a very different take on it. And your take also involves your activities when you were that age too. I wonder if you might want to talk about your experience in the Navy and how that related to this story.
You mean my heroic, really important role in the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, what I liked in the book was you analyze it, but you also made it personal, which to me made it more meaningful also, honestly.
Yeah. At the time, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was in the Navy. I was the air intelligence officer for my squadron, which meant that I held the top secret documents for nuclear war, which were buried in a safe within a safe. And of course, none of us ever expected to know what those documents said. We joked about it and said it was clippings from the New York Times. Anyway, I think it must have been October 15th or maybe the morning of the 16th. I was on the West Coast, so I was not directly involved in the crisis, but it was a worldwide crisis. And I was ordered to retrieve those documents, take them to my skipper's office, and read where we were deploying for if nuclear war broke out. I was in a VP squadron, that's an anti-submarine warfare squadron. And we were going to Baja California. And the reason for that was dispersing all of the aircraft away from military bases, which were assumed to be targeted by the Soviets, to bases that were not targeted, and therefore the aircraft would survive. And there were, we were junior officers, and the bachelors, the more irresponsible among us, would joke, "Oh, Baja California, it's a great place to die." Now, this was before Google, and I wasn't able to look it up then, but I have looked it up subsequently, and indeed, it is a great place to die. However, it was not great to die. So anyway, so I did have this personal relationship, which I think was part of the motivation for writing the book. But one does not have to have a personal motivation to recognize what a critical moment in world history the Cuban Missile Crisis was. I would say it was the most dangerous event that didn't happen. Right. And it was a pivotal event for the Cold War.
And you argue repeatedly in the book, very persuasively, that we were lucky, that it was not the supreme fine management by Kennedy. And we're going to talk about Kennedy and Douglas Dillon and Adlai Stevenson in the documents that you shared with the teachers. But before we get to that, I mean, you generally argue against this notion of Kennedy heroism, and instead place much more emphasis on luck and circumstance and how close to the edge we were. Is that fair to say?
Yes, maybe I'd rebalance it a little bit and say that, there's no question but that luck was critical, and I'll talk about exactly why. But there was also, by the end of the crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev both trying to do two contradictory things at once. Neither of them wanted a nuclear war. They were both determined to prevent a nuclear war, but at the same time, they were both determined to achieve some value out of this crisis. For Kennedy, it was the missiles had to be removed from Cuba. And for Khrushchev, there had to be a guarantee that Cuba would not be invaded. And a secondary consideration for Khrushchev was getting those provocative missiles out of Turkey. And that created a real dilemma, because Khrushchev announced over Radio Moscow that that was one of his demands for trading the missiles. And it's very interesting. We're talking about the end of that second week now. We're talking about Friday and Saturday. The crisis ends on Sunday. And here's the situation. Khrushchev, the night before, had sent a letter accepting the idea that Kennedy's pledge not to invade Cuba was sufficient to remove the missiles. And then a second letter arrives about 12 hours later, but the letter is read over Radio Moscow, so the whole world hears it. And he said, well, not only, the pledge not to invade Cuba, but it was necessary to get those missiles out of Turkey. Well, the missiles are junk. And they call them junk. I mean, that's a quotation. They are liquid fuel missiles, not in silos, sticking up right out of the ground. They can be taken out with a rifle. So they're very provocative and very vulnerable. And Kennedy says, okay, we'll do this, because they've been talking about all week about getting rid of these missiles. And all of a sudden, all his advisors say, oh, no, we cannot do this. We cannot trade with a gun to our head. And Kennedy says to them, we're not going to have, and this is a quote, we're not going to have a very good war if the whole world knows is all we had to do was take these junk missiles out of Turkey and trade them for the missiles in Cuba. But his advisors are adamant. And by the end of the crisis, Kennedy stands alone and with his determination to get those missiles, to trade those missiles out of Cuba. And he does it by sending Bobby, his brother, to see the Soviet ambassador and saying, we'll take him out, but it has to be kept a secret. And the Soviets go along with that for a variety of reasons.
It's actually always been amazing to me that the Soviets kept the secret, that Khrushchev himself didn't reveal it when he was criticized in '64 by other members of the Politburo. I actually have never understood why they didn't reveal the secret.
Well, I've thought of that a lot. And I think by that time it was too late, and the charges against him were not primarily for the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was his agricultural policy, his build down of the military, and all sorts of mistakes they believe that he had made. The question is why during 1963 and Khrushchev's outset, he didn't, reveal it. Right. And I think it's because he recognized that if he did reveal it, the possibility of rebuilding a relationship with the Americans was all over. He had lied to them for the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had been embarrassed by that profoundly, and therefore he was in a box. So he kept his word, and hoped to recreate a good relationship with Kennedy to try to resolve a lot of the issues that they were dealing with.
Right. One of the things you do very well in the book, and that I think would be really interesting for students, is to sort of walk through some of the decision-making around Kennedy. And the two documents you've shared with the teachers are actually documents that sort of help to show this. Douglas Dillon, on the one hand, is considered one of the most esteemed thinkers. He's a financial leader in the United States. And later on, he's the one who people keep encouraging Lyndon Johnson to talk to for a way out of Vietnam. He's supposed to be the all-knowing wise man, or one of these groups of wise men. And Adlai Stevenson is, of course, a former rival of Kennedy's, who's now ambassador to the UN. Maybe just talk a little bit about what you think these documents show, Marty, and how we should understand the XCOM, this collection of people advising Kennedy.
Right. So on October 16th, when McGeorge Bundy informs Kennedy that the missiles are there, Kennedy gives him a list of people right off the top of his head, about 14 people, to gather at 11:30 that morning. And that group of advisors becomes the executive committee of the National Security Council, nicknamed the XCOM. They're the Cuban Missile Crisis advisors. Among them are Douglas Dillon, who is a holdover now from the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy had a cabinet that was Republicans and Democrats. What's so interesting about Dillon is that he reflects the Eisenhower view, absolutely perfectly. Another very important advisor, but not an official member of the XCOM committee, is Adlai Stevenson, who Kennedy really dislikes. He has been a competitor when he ran in 1956 for president. Kennedy wanted to be the vice president. Stevenson wouldn't have him. Bobby Kennedy never forgave Adlai Stevenson, but Adlai Stevenson is the head of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And so it was better to have him in the tent rather than outside the tent. And Kennedy offers him a job he really didn't want. He wanted to be Secretary of State, but he offers him the job of ambassador to the UN, which Stevenson accepts. By luck, Stevenson has weeks ago made an appointment with Kennedy for lunch on October 16th. So that luncheon is right after the first XCOM meeting, in which, and I go into detail about that meeting, in which all of his advisors and Kennedy himself agree that it's necessary to either bomb the missiles to get them out, or invade Cuba, or maybe both. Joint Chiefs are for both. Okay, so they have lunch together. Kennedy takes Stevenson up to the family quarters and pulls out the photographs, shows them to Stevenson, and he says, well, we're gonna have to bomb or invade. And Stevenson, right off the bat, says, whoa, no, that is a very bad idea. This can be negotiated. And in effect, during that conversation, he lays out what becomes the blueprint for what Kennedy does to negotiate his way out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we know exactly what Stevenson said, because the next day he writes this memorandum, which I think I provided for the, okay. And in that memorandum, he says some very interesting things. He says to start or risk starting a nuclear war is bound to be divisive at best. And the judgments of history seldom coincide with the tempers of the moment. And of course, Kennedy is very much concerned about history. And he says, I know your dilemma is to strike before the Cuban sites are operational, or to risk waiting until a proper background of justification can be prepared. The national security must come first, but the means adopted have such incalculable consequences that I feel you should have made it clear that the existence of nuclear missile bases anywhere is negotiable before we start anything. And of course, he's thinking about Turkey, and that contrasts with another memorandum Kennedy receives the same day from Douglas Dillon, who says, I therefore believe that the survival of our nation demands the prompt elimination of the offensive weapons now in Cuba. This cannot be negotiable, and any course of action leading to negotiation on this issue, which inevitably would be prolonged, would have the results outlined above, which, are disaster. And so you have these two views, and Kennedy is starting off with kind of a Dillon view, but Stevenson has put this other view in his head, and it begins to impress Kennedy and he begins to think about it. And one of the wonderful things about having these, and I didn't mention it, these XCOM meetings are secretly taped. So we know exactly what Kennedy said and everybody else said in these meetings. And the wonderful thing about them is to see how Kennedy begins to change his mind, begins to think about consequences. One of the things Kennedy says again and again at each point of the crisis that nobody else raises in that meeting is, why did Khrushchev do it? He's always interested in understanding the point of view from the other guy. And because of that, he can think clearly and openly about the possibilities for getting out of this thing without a war.
And by implication, most of those around Kennedy are not empathizing with Khrushchev. They're not looking at it from his point of view, right? Why do you think that is? I know you have an explanation in the book. Why do you think that is?
Well, the people, especially advisors, but Kennedy too, live within a system, within a belief system. Politics is politics, but there's also an element of, I would call it religiosity, embedded in politics. I mean, you can see this in the crazy Trump stuff. But the nuclear weapons and the Cold War and the struggle between communism and capitalism and all of that is the dominant, view. And if Khrushchev did that, we've got to punch him hard, because the only thing Soviets understand is, force. And what is so interesting is when you look at the Soviet documents, that's exactly what Khrushchev says to the Politburo. The only thing the Americans understand is force. So, you have these, two conflicting, views that are going to lead to something terrible if cooler heads don't prevail.
And Marty, do you think it's the sobering effect of considering what a war would look like that leads Kennedy and Khrushchev to step back, or is it something else about them?
No, well, I think that's exactly right. He is a thoughtful guy. The interesting thing about Kennedy, and it's revealed so clearly in these tapes, is that this is a man who works on different levels. He accepts the world as it is. It is a pragmatist. He allows his ambitions to drive his career forward. He hates nuclear weapons. He says at one point during the crisis to his friend David Ormsby Gore, the ambassador from Britain to the United States, he said it's impossible to live in this world, hopefully with nuclear weapons. They're awful. But he also comes into office and builds up the Polaris submarine fleet, the nuclear weapons and everything. He accepts things the way they are. But then on another level, he thinks about consequences very, very wisely. And over the course of this early week, where the Americans are trying to decide what to do, he moves from invasion and bombing to Stevenson's view, and promotes the blockade, insists on the blockade. And the chiefs are absolutely out of their mind angry that a blockade is going to happen. But a blockade is an act of war, so that's dangerous too. But nevertheless, it gives Khrushchev a chance to take a deep breath and figure out, okay, now I have time to negotiate.
Yeah.
And that, the crisis ends up finally working out because both Kennedy and Khrushchev, we're back to this crisis management stuff, are determined not to start a war, but they are not in control.
Right.
They think they're in control, but they're not. And they begin to realize that as the week moves on what they call Black Saturday, uh, the Soviets in Cuba shoot down a U-2, which was unauthorized by Moscow, but Kennedy doesn't know that, and the ex-com doesn't know that. They assume anything that happens is authorized by Moscow. Khrushchev is thinking, oh my God, I'm losing control of this thing. And the most dangerous moment is also happening at that time when a Soviet submarine captain under the blockade line is convinced that the Americans are trying to sink him by throwing sort of grenades overboard, trying to bring him to the surface. And he has a nuclear weapon on board that submarine. It's Soviet sub B-59. The captain's name is Savitsky. He says, while we're doing somersaults down here, there's a war on the surface. We're not going to be the disgrace of the Soviet Navy. Load the nuclear torpedo. We're going to take them with us. And he's going to torpedo an American aircraft carrier with about 4,000 sailors aboard, more than 9/11 would have been killed. And at the last moment, another Soviet officer of the same rank, who was part of the fleet staff, being just luckily assigned to that boat, is a very cool head named Arkhipov, Vasily Arkhipov, and he talks Savitsky out of using the nuclear weapon for a variety of very interesting reasons. I mean, it's a very dramatic exchange, but it's just luck that Arkhipov was assigned to B-59. It could have been his boss who had a very different view.
Right. Right. And for those who are interested in the details, that's all in the book. The first, I know about this because I've read the book. I didn't know the story. I don't think most historians know the story, and it's riveting. And it's movie-like, Marty, right? I mean, it's Hunt for Red October, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Well, there actually was a not such a good movie made of this thing, but yeah, it's it's the stuff of drama that you may make up, but you don't make it up as well as what really happened.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the points, and I think this is a point we need to get across to students, right, is that these individuals at the top, the Kennedys and the Khrushchevs, they're enormously powerful and their decisions mean a lot, but they don't have full control. They never have full control, right? And that's what makes these systems complicated and also dangerous, right?
Absolutely. Any parent should realize that you have control, but you don't have full control.
I think I have no control at home, Marty. We have 2 teenagers now, so I've recognized that. I just write checks. That's all I do. Marty, what are some of the lessons that should come out of the correct lessons then to take from the Cuban Missile Crisis? Clearly, one lesson is not just be tough, flex your muscles. That's clearly not the right lesson from this, right? So what are the historical lessons as you see them?
Yes, it's exactly the opposite. And Kennedy understood these lessons, that you never have enough correct information. You're living in a world, a nuclear world, in which a mistake is potentially a final mistake, one that a civilization will not recover from. And as George Bundy said to me at one point, I talk about it in the book, he said, crisis managers can't control everything. He himself, realized that. So the idea that, we can manage these crises from A to Z is completely false. You set out policy, you manage the macro aspects of the policy, you can manage some of the micro aspects, but there are thousands, tens of thousands of troops out there of thousands of officers with command decision capability, who can make decisions that can undermine everything. I mean, take the shoot down of uh, uh, the American U-2 by the Soviets. This crew is manning this surface-to-air missile complex, and they get the word that there's a U-2 flying from the west to the east over Cuba. They have about 2 minutes or 3 minutes before that U-2 is going to pass over them. The commander calls the commander of all forces in Cuba, who has the authority to tell him whether to shoot it down or not. Can't find them. I don't know, he's playing tennis or he's doing this or whatever. So he makes the decision on his own because Castro has been badgering him, all of the Russians, what are these missiles for? The Americans are flying over our territory. They're getting ready to see where we are for their invasion. Shoot them down. So this is in this guy's head, and he just makes the command decision, shoot it down. Well, that could have started a war, right there. So, the profound lesson is, you just cannot control, sort of crises. And I keep worrying about, to bring things up to the present, all this talk about, China is our enemy. We're, war with China. We're sending, the Navy, challenging China. China's Navy's challenging us. These kinds of this kind of thinking and the policies that flow from it are extremely dangerous because they will not necessarily, end up with the consequences you are trying to achieve. There are almost always unintended consequences that can be very, very dangerous.
Right. I think that's very well said, and I think that's a lesson we all need to learn and to relearn because we forget. We tend to forget. Marty, thank you for sharing with us. I want to again just remind the teachers the book is called Gambling with Armageddon. Beautiful, beautiful cover. It's a thick book, but it's fun to read. Once in a while, as I was reading it, it fell on my face, but it was okay. I still keep reading.
That's why you're all bruised. Huh?
I hope everyone will read it and incorporate really this exciting material into the teaching of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you again, Martin Sherwin, for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Lovely talking to you. Terrific. And the teachers. Enjoy.